I think that's where we have all the.
Hi, everyone. My name is Emily, and I'll be co-hosting this session with Marlinda today. And we have a really interesting panel on conversation design systems. So this is something that's been evolving and changing. It's not something that's standardized in any way. So we just want to learn more about what people are doing and the different approaches that can be taken to create these. So let's do a round of introductions and we'll get started. Daniel, do you want to go first?
Yeah, for sure. Hi, everyone. My name is Daniel Fraga. I am leading UX UI design at Danske Bank's generative AI tribe, where we are building a lot of Gen AI powered tools for internal banking purposes. And other than that, I've also got a background in many other things from architecture to conversation design per se. And pleasure to meet you all.
Awesome. Thank you. Steph?
Hey everyone, I'm Steph Rymer. I'm a lead experience designer at Verizon on the conversational and search design team, and mostly focused on kind of building out our design system components for conversational experiences, and also working in conversation design, getting those into various flows and experiences throughout the chat.
Awesome. Joseph?
Hello, I'm Joseph, and I work at Uber now for about 2.5 years on the content design team as a conversation designer, and especially doing a lot of Gen AI stuff the last couple of years. Before that was about 5 years building out a conversation design platform for health use cases called Sensely, and before that was an academic life as a linguist.
Cool. Yeah. Brooke?
Of course, the unmute. My name is Brooke Hawkins. I'm a conversational designer, currently freelance, so picking up different contracts here and there. Most recently, I was working at General Motors as a conversational design system lead there. And prior to that, I've been working in conversational interfaces for a little over a decade. So designing everything from IVR experiences to chatbot experiences to voice experiences that you interact with at a grocery store with a voice interface. So all different kinds of things, all in the world of conversation.
That's awesome. Well, thank you all for being here. And I guess since Marlinda is our guest co-host for today, do you want to give a small introduction as well?
Sure. Hi, I'm not Julia. My name is Marlinda. I'm a conversation designer at Zendesk. Yeah, pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
Awesome. Well, I'll pass it off to you for the first question.
Yeah, I mean, to get it started for this topic, let's level set for the folks who are tuning in who might not know what a conversation design system is, especially if they're just starting off and then the single conversation designer, they might not know that's something that they might want to consider building. So what is a conversation design system?
Joseph, do you want to start?
Me?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah, it's an interesting question, and I often haven't thought of it as a thing. It's in many ways, it's just what I do, which is building out more and more repeatable frameworks for conversation design products. But in some ways, this event has gotten me to think about what is a conversation design system. So one way I think about it is on analogy to the design system we have at Uber as a whole called Base. And so mix of components and frameworks and the guidance and how to use them. So working with the Base team to add guidance for the parts that apply to conversation. So the chat UI on the visual side, as well as starting to build out like all the different parts of conversations. So I think that's the thing that I've been pushing a lot for is the modularization of conversation structure. So having things like welcome modules and handoff modules and wrap up modules, and then each of the different pieces so that those things can be reused. And then for scale, adding lots of configuration options so that there may be some standardization, some guidance, and pre-existing templates and examples and so on. But you can toggle certain things to get different types of experiences with those modules. And then Gen AI coming on the scene, how to incorporate, but not, well, we could talk about Gen AI, like how much is brand new and how much is just adjustments with this new tool. But that has changed the work as well.
Brooke, you want to?
Yeah, just to build off what you said, Joseph, yeah, I think when you had originally posed the question, I was thinking about, very in particular what I have building recently, but you're right, really conversational design systems are kind of an evolution, and I think always something we have built, as you said. And in some of my early roles, I think we didn't call it this at the time, but a design system there looked like creating IVR calls for different use cases and then building out reusable libraries where we could reuse some of those flows or trees or bits of logic, including instructions for how some of those things could be repurposed for saving us time and making us do our work faster. So that was a rudimentary example of a design system. And then, yes, most recently, I think teams are taking a more thoughtful approach about how we can scale our design and make kind of rules or guidelines for our conversational work, especially as we're working with more multimodal teams. So that's kind of the work that I've been doing more recently. And then, yes, in this LLM world, I think kind of thinking of the design system as potentially, less exacting rules and guidelines and components for us as designers, even though it definitely very much still is that, but also potentially rules and instructions that we can feed an LLM so that, maybe we're doing less of the granular design work, but giving the LLMs that kind of those rules to go off and do things the way that we hope they will, so we can focus on juicier design problems.
Steph, anything to add?
Yeah, I think I kind of say a similar thing. Like in thinking about this question, it was definitely kind of starting from the place of, okay, what are traditional design systems, like components, guidance, sets of patterns? And I think in like for traditional interfaces, those are that alignment upon what those are is a little bit more standardized. For conversation, there's so many other things you can potentially layer onto it, kind of top level core elements, like how do you greet or close or get feedback in a conversation. There's all of the kind of persona guidance that you can layer on, modular like language components, as well as like the UI type components you'd find in a more traditional system. Plus there's kind of, I'm not as familiar with this side of things, but I think there's a lot of like audio elements that can potentially go into more conversational focused ones too. So it's starting from the same place as traditional design systems, but there's a lot of ways that can go for conversational as well.
Daniel?
Yeah, I really agree with that point, Joseph, around modularization. I think a system needs to somehow define the scenarios for, like the key scenarios or the key moments or the key modules that account for a part of the experience, right? And yes, that experience has conversational and linguistic elements, but of course it goes beyond it, and that's kind of my job to say, since I'm a little bit more towards the UX UI side. But I like to think of it as a multimodal thing, right? It's both the scenarios and the moments for a user, and then sort of having that in a system, the moments, the atoms of experience almost, and then the rules for their selection, the rules for which one is relevant when, and how, like, that's enough material to spend ages exploring, but I think those are the two key things, right?
Yeah, so I was curious, where do you even start kind of building these? Like, are you starting from scratch, or did you, I guess maybe Brooke can start, or did you have something to work off of already?
Yeah, I think on different teams it's been different, but most recently for the design system work I was doing, by the time I joined the team, I think, most teams have some kind of, institutional knowledge about why things are being done a certain way, or documentation about how past projects have gone, or, even documentation about, research or feedback or things like that. So really kind of starting from there and starting to take all those internal kind of do's and don'ts and put those into rules and best practices. And then, really, even when you think that's a good first draft, really reviewing that with so many folks and teams, and you end up getting, in my experience, a lot of that kind of verbal information that maybe wasn't included in that documentation to get you moving as well. So yeah, it's a little bit of like kind of going through someone's attic with all of their old boxes and starting to sort things out. In my experience, it's there, but maybe not in that reusable form that we're trying to make yet.
Right. Anyone else have any thoughts?
I guess for us, it sort of almost accidentally stemmed out of some really early work on defining persona. So a lot of kind of research went into defining what are the attributes of our assistant's persona, and kind of coming up with recommendations around how that can apply to linguistic tone and style. And as we were doing that on the content side of things, it sort of opened up this question of like UI elements as well. As we're going through these experiences, we were noticing what probably should be very similar kind of widgets or components being built slightly differently depending on the team that created it or the channel that it was coming through. And that sort of opened up, well, we're doing this work to standardize the content and the kind of language style. How can we apply that to the UI elements and the conversational patterns and structures as well? We were kind of lucky in that we have a central design system for digital, Verizon design system. So that was a base for us to kind of build off on the UI side, but there was still a lot of adaptation that needed to happen for conversational too.
I'm sort of building a model in my head of like the different approaches, but maybe that's the system and thinking. But like there's sort of a ground up approach where you just build a lot of stuff and you start to see patterns, and then you like pull those patterns out and then reuse them. And I think when you're one designer, you can get away with it because you're like, oh, I built this other thing, and you take pieces. But once you want to make it more sort of general, you need to abstract that for other people to use. So that's sort of the ground up. Then there's the top down, which is like, what general guidance do we want? And maybe this is stuff what you're thinking with persona design, like what kind of personality do we want? What kind of experiences are our North Star? And then the side in would be like all the teams doing similar things, like the design systems team for the UI, content design guidelines. Our team has done a lot of work on that front, and how much of that can we just pull into the conversational content? And sort of maybe the confluence of all of those different efforts end up becoming more of a system.
I think it depends a lot on how mature the team is and how many people are actually using the system. One of the things that I notice on my current job is that the processes are being built, and so that it's not like there's a pre-existing system that one can lean to. So the approach is kind of the shotgun approach, just so you kind of start everywhere, and all of these threads that you start are sort of incomplete, but as each of them sort of advances in their own side, it kind of informs the others, and the system that grows as an artifact as well as something that supports other people's creations. And that's, do we revise our audience persona? Have we tested against that persona? Maybe you can do that on the go. Do you want to update the system personalities and the way that those things are sort of defined on the go? Yeah. So I mean, I would assume that in organizations where those systems are more well defined, that it's one game, and when you're setting that up, it's a game that has to do with investigating what might be the operating model for that. Like, how will the people use this and when? So it's kind of a design object in and of itself.
Marlinda, do you want to go for the next one?
Yeah, I'm actually gonna kind of take Anne Cantera's question here and kind of loop it in, because I have two parts to this. One question is localization. how are you guys thinking about design systems for localization? And how are you managing everything? Do you have everything English separate and then like each separate language that your company is doing with all the notes? Or like, yeah, that's quite a lot to manage, especially, and easier for when you're a team of one. But then when you start scaling, how do you keep everybody aligned and manage everything? Joseph, do you want to go first?
I'm reading the question and listening to you. So localization was one of the topics, or is it about how to have a system?
Kind of a mix between localization and organization. So
yeah.
So maybe we'll split it into two then.
Yeah.
Maybe start with localization.
Sorry.
My sense is localization is changing with Gen AI because Gen AI is so much better at English in general, or at least we often start with English and then go from there. And so how to expand and localize with Gen AI products is probably a different process, requires different evaluation frameworks, training data, and so on. Whereas other localization efforts might be more straightforward in terms of translating defined strings, and the flow itself might be more or less the same. And then ideally there would be local teams that can review and do all the real localization checking. That's my experience. My experience also is that there's usually like a lingua franca for the design team to operate in, and it's probably English, at least in my experience. Yeah.
Does anyone else have any experience with localization with these systems? Okay, let's. How about?
Topic.
Oh, so okay. The second part. I'll just bring up Anne's question. It feels like there's no platform that will work to have everything in one spot. So if you have subflows and flows, UI design, dev documentation, and on and on. So Anne was wondering if anyone has any tips for organizing when you may have documentation in Lucid, Excel, Figma, where it lives in different places, and how you kind of get everyone to to go where you need them to go.
Yeah, I can say a little bit on this one. I just want to validate that question and say, yes, it is hard. And almost every team I've worked on, yeah, there's exactly that documentation in so many different places. And you're trying to get everyone to kind of look to one place as a source of information, or at least some kind of hub. And yes, it can be quite difficult. In the past, I found, it helpful to maybe pick one place, like in my past experience, it's either been Figma or there are some, browser kinds of like CMS tools you can use, web-based ones, I should say, where you're starting to gather some of that content, maybe cross-linking to some of those other pieces of documentation. And it's almost like you're trying to create a library that's annotating some of those other documents. So you're not necessarily editing all of the millions of documents, but you've got a place where you're pulling links to those things in. I found that helpful. But yes, even then, it's a lot of sharing that documentation regularly, making sure people know where the link to that is, making sure links to the things you're referencing are updated. So it is a bit of librarian work that we're doing as well, trying to be the stewards and the kind of owners of all of this documentation as we're referencing it. But yes, definitely. One recommendation is to kind of create some kind of hub and to kind of bring links to various things there.
Anyone else have any tips? Or
I agree with that approach. I'm partial to tools where I can put those things in flows, so little boxes with arrows and links annotated endlessly. That usually helps have a even if it's like there's a legibility to the system that I very much appreciate. Like I like to look at it and be like, okay, I know it's this much, and here's where the things are. And of course, then you can double click and annotate, but the flow still feels to me like one of the fundamental design system tools.
Yeah, I think there was a question when Gen AI hit the scene if flows would no longer be relevant, and I think the answer is no, they are still relevant, even if they're changing. But I love having a source of truth document that everything gets linked from. So Brooke, your point about hubs, and a flow tool or Figma or Lucid, some canvas, isn't the best for everything. And so then just lots of links when relevant to spreadsheets, documentation, other places. You can paste screenshots, because I found that a lot of colleagues benefit from seeing the UI itself. I'm so used to looking at flowcharts that I can instantly abstract to like what the chat UI would feel like, but a lot of people prefer to see that. So yeah, one source of truth.
Steph, do you have any?
Yeah, no, that's like a question we've been asking ourselves a lot recently, and trying to kind of work through. I think definitely having that source of truth is important. We're not quite there yet, but just kind of working on, I think, organizing, like creating our own taxonomy for how conversations exist and are organized, how components potentially link to those, how different topics connect with each other. Because right now it just feels like this big kind of overwhelming, there's thousands of different intents and conversations, and just working through and categorizing those as at least a starting point to say like, okay, the design for this experience lives here. It might not necessarily all be in the same format right now, and that's okay. But just at least getting that lay of the land of what's out there is a good starting point.
I'm wondering what you all think of, if I can jump in.
Go for it, yeah, please.
Like how much to document? Because I feel like one of the pressures I often feel is to document everything, but then things change really quickly, and then you end up redocumenting. But then if you document nothing, then it's only in your own head, and people can't benefit from it. And I think the size of the company could make a difference here, how many colleagues you have who would benefit, and so on. So I'm curious how people approach, like, when do you document, how much, as well as where do you document?
That's a good question. It's making me think. I'm answering a part of your question, I think, but maybe not all of it. But I found helpful in projects in the past to, I think, Steph, you're kind of getting at this, like the idea of kind of a taxonomy is sort of helpful. So before doing any kind of documentation, before developing any kind of design system, kind of figuring out what that almost IA of the information architecture of what you're trying to tell with a design system, creating that first, I think, is helpful to know kind of like what pieces or components or things you're even trying to capture out of a design system. And then, maybe you don't have content for your design system yet, but that can inform as you're going through your work, what is it exactly out of this project that I'm trying to document? Is it the components that I'm using? Is it any best practices as I'm designing the conversation itself? Why I maybe made different design decisions, how am I envisioning that will feed into this design system? That has kind of helped me in the past as I'm working through work. Like I'm almost seeing where the future use of that information will be, because I know what I hope I'm creating out of a design system, and that can inform how I'm documenting my work as I'm doing it.
Yeah, just kind of add to that in terms of like, and this might be more of a luxury of working somewhere with like a bigger team, but I think one thing that we found helpful is I guess it's sort of different tiers. So like seeing the design system for conversational as like a kind of product or platform layer that we're documenting sort of conversational wide guidance as part of. But then the teams that are working on individual flows, like you'll have like folks that are working on account and billing flows, or folks that are working on troubleshooting flows, and they have their sort of own local libraries where they capture like local components that are just for their subject area, and documentation around that. So splitting that off, like almost splitting up the burden of like documenting those things has been helpful.
I guess if I can jump in, Steph, you made me think about how answering this question is sort of dependent on the challenge itself. What I mean by this is that I've looked at this broadly understood conversation design challenge from different sides. So when I was at the Fjord, later Accenture, it was very much short-lived projects that were mostly conversation design for customer service, which is rather different than some of the later challenges that we had, which was conversation design for sort of self-contained use cases that use LLMs. I mean, these are completely different things. They're still conversational, but the way that I approached documentation for both of those were different. So in the first one, it was sort of extensively, it's my pen to the paper. I write the words. The second one is almost like, okay, what are the rules and what are the scenarios we can break down? And it's a whole different challenge. To give an example, right? It was trying to define the conditions that governed the conversations that a user had with a tool that was supposed to train them. So the user was supposed to train by talking to this bot, but then how might we vary the personality of the bot? And it's for training, it's not for fulfilling a use case as you would in customer service. And as a final example, what we're doing right now is very much letting users access themselves a library of prompts so that they themselves, there's another degree of abstraction if I'm making myself clear. So it's the user who is the one who has all the modular pieces to govern the conversation, but they use those Lego blocks themselves. So I would say like these are three. This is all still conversation design as far as I see it, but different levels of abstraction.
Marlinda, do you have? You take the next one.
Yeah. So then that's, sorry, I'm still thinking about, because Joseph, you brought such a good question there. Now it's just kind of made me think of like my own work where there are a lot of, for example, especially because a lot of things are being updated about the product. So when those change on the fly from the top down, it kind of becomes tiresome to document every single word that I created for this one flow, then localize it, then have to relocalize everything. So kind of what I've started doing is sort of just tracking like initiatives, if that makes sense, like high level initiative projects that we have with a certain end goal, and then making notes in between. But yeah, no longer highly documentation of like every single word that changes. So
yeah, what's helped me at least is like creating a framework and just like putting the bare bones structure of what we're trying to accomplish, and then I can add examples of like what we've done with it that can vary. But I think that has been the most effective, I think, for me.
Later today or tomorrow.
So yeah, I was wondering if like how you even socialize these systems and like how you even get started. I mean, I found that especially in bigger corporations, people are just doing their own thing. There's so many people involved. Like, do you have any tips or approaches to starting to get people to actually use the systems that you're creating?
I could go, and I suspect others will have really good answers to this one. I've found that probably the most challenging part of working in design systems by far. So yes, in my past experience, really, I think this is an opportunity for folks that are working in conversational design systems and in kind of compiling design system work to really lead and drive, that work. So yes, in my past experience, it's taken a lot of, ownership of that documentation, socializing it, really getting time and meetings with people on their calendars and trying to socialize and share the work that you're creating and getting that kind of active feedback. Is this how you document things in your work? Yes or no? Getting those kind of important conversations going. And then as much as possible, trying to align, and I think this is where other folks will have good answers, align with other teams that are doing design system work. Past places I've worked, like at General Motors, there are other teams that are doing more of the visual user interface design system work, and maybe across different vehicles or areas of GM. So really trying to align to those teams and kind of keep track of what they're doing, so that on the content and conversational side, we're keeping track with that work, and we're included in those conversations. But yeah, it's a lot more like, I guess, the evangelization of your work than maybe any of us anticipate when we get started with this work.
Anyone else?
Yeah, I think similar for us. I think one thing that helped was like connecting with smaller teams on kind of a case by case basis. I think initially we were just trying to like, oh, let's like email everyone, like here's the thing, and that can get overlooked pretty easily. But once we started kind of setting up kind of small connects with the teams that were kind of working on using these things, we'd have sort of like I think we called it like a roadshow at the time, where it was like a little session where we had sort of quizzes, and we'd have like, okay, here's an example of like, this one is too formal, and this one is too casual, and this one is just right, like, or like which one is which, and have people kind of jump on and guess for some of the kind of stylistic stuff, and then for some of the more structural stuff, we kind of take them through the process. And I think that kind of, not quite individual, but individual team attention helped get people feel like they were involved.
I've literally used the phrase roadshow many times, and usually it ends up not becoming a very long road, but it's like an ambition to go. So yeah, evangelizing, setting up like presentations for different teams, conversation design 101 workshops, constantly referencing the source of truth documentation, getting a champion who also believes in it is really helpful. So it's not just me. Sort of showing the impact of using it versus not using it, which I could do better. But hey, this team did it without the system, and look, these transitions are abrupt and confusing. With the system, look at these transitions. I mean, ideally, I don't want to say it's always perfect, but yeah, those are a few ideas.
Daniel, anything?
Totally agree. But my answer isn't going to add anything new. Really, just presenting it to people and gathering the feedback from those people who will eventually be the users, and also getting them invested in, hey, but why don't we change this? Why don't we change that? And it's sort of a co-creative thing from then on. But looking at the system as if it was a product in and of itself that you test, whose users are other colleagues, right? And then you just repeat forever. And it's never finished. It's never perfect, but it's better than not having one, for sure.
I feel like there's a lot of adaptation. Oh, sorry, Emily.
Oh, no, go ahead.
I feel like I've tried to learn how to adapt it for different audiences. So like other conversation designers, you can just like hit the ground running. Content designers, the content part is straightforward, but the flows might be more new. Leadership, probably show screenshots. They're not as deep in the weeds. Engineers, the flows are probably very satisfying because they're thinking structurally, but the content might be different. I mean, I'm sort of generalizing here, but there's just different audiences might have different ways of engaging. So ideally, we can flexibly adapt to share.
Yeah, it's so important to know how to communicate to each group of people, and everyone processes or knows different things. And yeah. And also what Daniel said about pulling people in too, I feel like that helps them feel like they have part ownership of it. And yeah, it just it's better. Marlinda, do you have a...
Yeah. So then kind of going off of that, I know these are the people that you're talking about that you show these to, but can we dig in a little more into collaboration? So for example, I mean, you have the conversation design patterns, but let's say a company already has a brand voice. So, maybe you think about bringing that team in, and how do you create that collaboration? And who are the other people in addition to that you would add to collaborate with? Steph, do you want to take that one first?
Sure. So definitely the main design systems team were a big source of, because they were creating the original components that we were kind of building off of, meeting with them and making sure everything's kind of in line with how they're seeing it. I think there's also, in part, this is just because of how we're structured, like as the conversational team, we're working on kind of the design, conversation design library, but we're also kind of working on the actual kind of flows and experience. And I think a lot of, especially like initially getting that conversational system off the ground was grounded in the flow work, because that's the part that the business needs to see getting done. So mostly like collaborating with the product owners and the business folks who work on those kind of product areas like conversational billing, conversational shopping, and the design system side of things almost like drops out of that flow work. Still working on like having like getting to the place where we have kind of more of a dedicated, centralized set of folks that are kind of working towards that design system. But yeah, for now, everything kind of comes out of that flow work and that side of collaboration.
The reason why I asked this question is because I've heard of a team where the content team that was there before basically had the final say in how the conversation designs will go. Instead of you owning everything, you can suggest things. And so, yeah, I'm just curious how people are when it comes to those kind of structures, if any of you have any other experience around that.
Yeah, the only other things I would add is, yeah, I just want to validate for your example and anybody else out there. If you're a team of one, or maybe you're a conversational designer who's been tasked with working on a design system, but it's only part of your responsibilities, it is so hard. And that's definitely a position I've been in the past, for sure. Yeah, it really helps, I think, as Joseph was mentioning, to get some kind of champion in the organization to care that the design system work is happening or needs to be done, because I think at the core of this question that, yeah, really having collaborators more than one person to work on putting together this documentation is incredibly important. And in the past, even if the core collaborators are just a group of conversational designers that are tasked with kind of contacting a marketing team or contacting a research team or contacting a content team and kind of pulling all the information together, at least having a few brains together to kind of sort through that information architecture. What are you trying to tell? And kind of bounce ideas back and forth off of each other about why is this the best practice, or why do we do things this way? And kind of having that group or more than one person really does help make that work get done a little bit better. But if you are out there and you are kind of alone in this work, just as I was saying before, make sure you view yourself as a champion of the work and see yourself as a leader, and set those meetings, get people talking to you, do the road shows. I love those examples of the workshops and the road shows. You're kind of a steward of the work in that position. So yeah.
Daniel, Joseph, anything else?
Yeah. I think it's such an interesting question because it varies a little bit depending on the organization, right? Like, I've noticed that whenever I think of a design system in certain organizations which have very set processes, then it's about, okay, where's my place and who would I have to talk to? And it's more like there's a rigid structure. When that structure is absent, what happens or what might happen is that part of the role of a design system, of a conversation design system, is also instructions on process, instructions on ways of working. You take this, then you do this, then you deliver that, right? It's not just the content, but the method. And when you talk about method, then that's the conversation that is interesting, because then the other people, the other roles, the other departments become involved, right? So who do you hand over to? Who do you get the requirements from? How does that process work? How does that connect to the objectives broadly in the organization? So there's membranes, right? Between, okay, there's a design system and I will only focus on that. But if the membrane is a little bit permeable, then all of a sudden the design system has space to make comments to other processes and other people's ways of working. And that can be a little, I think that's where the conversation becomes less of just the praxis of conversation design, and it becomes more of a general product conversation. And if things are united vertically, then it makes sense. Then you avoid the silo, right? Then you avoid the I'm doing this, but other people aren't hearing me. What's happening?
Just
thinking about all the teams we need to be able to do our work well. And I do often think about structure and content as a way of thinking about conversation design. And on the content side, there's like legal, brand, marketing, my content design colleagues, voice and tone and all that. I think on the structure side, it's mostly product and engineering, ML teams, things like that. I think I've learned to also cede some control. I think historically my flows I would be pretty like controlled about, but there's so much happening where the engineers and the product teams are like sort of doing conversation design, but they might not think of it that way. But then I look at what they're doing and I'm like, oh, okay, let me pull that into the system and try to systematize it or standardize it and make it work in other use cases. And so in some ways, I do a lot of talking to different teams just to see what's going on. Uber's a big company. And then I'll find like, oh, you're doing this cool thing that's similar to this. Let me pull it in, add a configuration, and then suddenly we've got a more robust module. Cool. But I didn't necessarily have the idea, and I don't know all the features being deployed. Like there's just so much stuff happening. But I try to act as a hub to consolidate and create that like broad view of conversation products within the company. Yeah.
so I want to go back to go Daniel. Go ahead.
Not to speak of users, right? We need to collaborate with
Yeah.
those two.
Oh my goodness. Yes, we haven't even talked about research.
So I actually want to go back to something you talked about. We mentioned at the beginning with LLMs, and I'm wondering if LLMs has changed your approach to your thinking around conversation design systems, and I guess what that means for the user experience and how you document it even.
Yeah, I could say, a couple of things. In terms of LLMs and the design system work, definitely starting to think about how some of those kind of rules for different things like components, we called them. They could be called probably a lot of different things, but things like welcome messages, closing messages, or bargains, reprompts, however you're breaking down your conversational experiences to create chunks that you're giving instructions for. Starting to think about how all of those rules and examples might be fed to an LLM to give the LLM itself, instructions about how to carry on a conversation that fits our best practices. That changes a little bit, making sure we're documenting in a way, adding examples, adding, instructions that could be fed in. Also thinking a little bit too about, as Steph, you were mentioning some of that persona work. That's an excellent example that definitely, spurs, I think, a lot of time why you're putting together a design system, is trying to kind of create that cohesive voice. Using any of that persona information or documentation to also feed into an LLM is something that has come up in past roles as well, and usually kind of started the thinking of like, oh, maybe we could feed all of this design system work into an LLM. But giving an LLM some of those instructions, like, you're going to have this voice, you're going to have this tone, never mention these topics, make sure you mention these topics. That's typically the kind of, at least in my past experience, the start of thinking about how to feed some of this content and best practices into an LLM. And then, I guess really the sky's the limit. We could feed all of the whole design systems to the LLMs, and then we would be less designing every single piece of a conversation and more we're the stewards of the rules and the instructions and, the tuning of conversations. So yeah.
Anyone else?
One of the things, like, this is probably less immediate and more kind of further out thinking, but one of the things I'm super excited about is like a kind of potential next place is kind of moving away from that separation between, you have apps and websites, and then you have chat as this little thing in the corner. And I think LLMs really open up the possibility of that being less of a strict separation and more kind of thinking about like hybrid experiences and what's the best kind of interface for the scenario, depending what someone's looking for, whether it's a command and click interaction or kind of verbal requirements. And I think that definitely opens up the question of, like, I think quite a few of us have mentioned, like, we have a main digital design system, and then we have our conversation design system. And those are considered sort of separate libraries, separate processes. So yeah, like, how can those like eventually come together and become more integrated, and like what takes precedent in certain cases where you might have principles that apply to both. All kind of open questions right now, but stuff I'm curious about.
Yeah, go for it, Daniel.
Yeah, thanks. Yeah, I just wanted to say it's such a big topic and there's so much space. I think what's some of the most sort of exciting stuff that I've explored around this has to do with, it's kind of a cliche to say it at this time, but yes, LLMs help us do old things faster. But the new things that it enables us to do, especially as we're building these systems of conversation, are really exciting. For example, how would you instruct a system, an LLM-powered system, to vary their output based on a perception of how the user is feeling and their state, right? If the user is frustrated, use the language in this model. If the user seems like they haven't slept that much, keep the cognitive load low. If the user seems to be of a particular persona, speak to them in this way. Or the reverse, the system could modulate its personality to test the user. Okay, now pretend to be a very angry customer. Now pretend to be a very tech-savvy customer. Now pretend to be... So all of these things, right? Defining these conditions, these if-then conditions, and then, of course, the instructions that go inside of each module that get decided there. I feel like this is, one of the things that I've been the most fascinated by with leveraging LLMs for conversation, because suddenly the system can... It's not like the system has a theory of mind. It's not sentient. There's somebody behind the veil pulling the strings, but certainly we can pretend very well, and I think that opens up a new field for creativity.
Joseph?
Yeah, I guess this builds on both of these comments. Like, it changes how I do chat work, and it also raises the question of what is conversation, and going beyond the chat UI. I think, Steph, you were getting at that. And I feel like it has changed how I do chat work and how the design system, it's guidance instead of strings, although writing strings is important for examples and training data and assessing quality. It's more evaluation. I spend more time on that. But I think where a lot of I'm not even sure what to call it, but I think there's a lot of opportunity in like breaking apart chat or creating experiences that are smart behind the scenes, but don't necessarily show up as obviously chat or conversation. And so maybe the intelligence of just-in-time interactions, and is conversation almost more of a metaphor than a chat container, where it's jumping in and allowing you to interact if you want. I think one thing that I keep coming back to is like typing is a lot of work for a user relative to clicking or not having to do anything. So maybe like the best thing is nothing. If we can be smart, then suddenly your account has populated into it an offer that you would have wanted and you never had to say you wanted it or whatever it is. So I'm trying to think, in terms of AI as this more varied behind the scenes intelligence opportunity, although I don't know what that looks like necessarily.
So we do have a couple. Oh, go ahead, Daniel.
So, I mean, I'll be very quick. Like Jacob Nielsen's, he posted this one text that everybody has been posting around, and it's kind of one really like nice idea that I carry around, which is the difference between graphical user interfaces, right, that we've had for the last 50, 70 years, and the transition that he claims is now happening with LLMs, such that every interface is somehow becoming conversational. So instead of the computer having there in a fixed way, in a menu, in a dropdown, the instructions for what it does, and then you tell it what you want it to do. Now we kind of tell it the outcome, you just in English, and that's a huge paradigm shift. So while on the one hand, graphical user interface is now changing massively. Now you're seeing all of these enhanced with AI buttons and autocompletes and so many new products coming up with that. The reverse is probably also happening where, as you say, Joseph, conversation is now going outside of the chat window and getting spread all over text input fields, spread throughout your screens. And I think that's it's both things mixing and becoming like this fuzzy new something else.
And then what does that mean for a conversation design system? It like raises all kinds of new questions. Is it different entry points? Is it like the modules themselves are different? Is our role different? I don't know. I'm just expanding.
Yeah.
And
Sorry.
sorry, no.
Go ahead.
I was just going to say, well, to expand further on that, we have a few questions in the chat around voice. So does anyone here on the panel have any experience around like voice, and how are you involved in it, and how do you incorporate that into your chat-based conversation design?
Before we get started, I know there are a couple other questions. We will answer those offline, but yeah. Okay. Sorry. Anyone want to start with this one?
Voice. I feel like this topic comes up a lot. I used to work in a multimodal interface where voice was sort of front and center. I couldn't avoid it. It was an avatar talking. You could do chat, you could do voice. Now I mostly work in chat, and so voice is sort of this other world, and I think voice does need special consideration. I think there's a desire sometimes to just layer voice on top of chat. Maybe for some things that works. In other ways, it really doesn't. I almost want to like go off on this very long sort of discussion about voice, but yeah, maybe I'll stop there.
No, yeah, that makes sense. I'm trying to think, I like your experience, Joseph, and my work more recently. I've been working more multimodally, so voice definitely is a component, but it's more trying to document how we approach. I guess I'm going to use the word content, but like the way we're delivering information, and then the modality we're trying to be a little bit in the passive. As we're documenting, had been trying to be more modality agnostic. So then that affected the examples and would always open big cans of worms. So but I do have, some examples of early kind of design systems that I created related to voice in past roles where I was working primarily in IVR. We didn't really call them design systems at the time because this was in the 2013, 2014. But we would create documents for our customers that explained why we were making different script choices or kind of why we would make different choices in our IVR voice first designs because often when you're, reviewing a script with a client or reviewing a script with users, they see that text as text. And so everyone, has an opinion about the written word and, would often come in and make revisions to the text or think that things could be worded a different way or try to add in more information. And so that early form of the design system was more about kind of explaining, having best practices right in line with that scripted text to say, this is how this actually is delivered via voice. And we word the sentence this way because delivered audially, users need to hear, the question at the end of the sentence, or things need to be shortened for comprehension, or, all of those things. So I think similar to documenting for any modality, really you're just trying to capture what are those best practices or things that are needed for the particular modality that you're delivering in. And that was one way, I guess, we did it when we were working only in voice, was to say, whoever's reading this, I know you're reading this as text, but it's not. Here are the things that we're thinking of because it needs to be delivered as voice. So yeah.
Anyone else?
So it's been a couple of years since I was in a team working with voice. Last time it was like a voice assisted test drive type gig. But I can only speculate that, as Anne is saying in the comments, voice is infinitely tougher. And truly, I think it is, because especially in the age where we have 11 labs and when we have all these new models coming out like every week, there's a deeper question at play, right? Yes, we are the experts of taking the user from A to Z, and obviously curating the content that we put in front of them. But if we have 11 labs in GPT-03, then what's the design thinking to focus on? And there's plenty, I think, right? From, Emily, we were talking recently about, imagine exhaustively mapping the voice intonation, all the ways that you could intonate a question. Like, do you ask a question like this or like that? All of these even new notations. We were talking about the way that I think it's in India, the Indian music notational system. And we were using that to describe that sort of notation of how voice and intonation comes up. I mean, there's definitely I know my answer to these questions is always what if, and then looking at the future, but truly, the horizon is very big. And then the question is, what might we do with voice now that the affordances are so much wider than we had access to previously? And that's a speculative question, but I think it's very important to ask it.
I know we're running out of time. I know there's so much more stuff we can get to with this, but I think I just want to end on the last question. What new challenges do you anticipate as conversation design becomes more widespread and technology is evolving and interactions are becoming seemingly more complex and layered?
Yeah, I can start. I think we touched on a lot of them during our conversation today. Yeah, really, I guess I'll make a little list, but yeah, really evangelizing the work within your organization is a huge challenge, I think, just as a start, and it's not a far challenge, it's a today challenge. Getting people to care about design systems, getting people to help you so you're not a team of one, and getting that kind of group around the importance of the design system. And then, moving forward, making sure the design system, those rules, those components, those things you're designing make sense when applied multimodally, if that applies to your organization. But, we're only moving further in that direction. And then, figuring out, I think all of us are curious, as we use LLMs more and maybe our design system work is more of those rules and guidance for LLMs, how will our work shift? What other things do we need to document? That's going to open up a whole can of worms.
Yeah, I think to add to that in terms of shifting roles, going back to the what we were talking about in terms of kind of conversational versus traditional experiences, and as those become potentially more integrated and complex, I think one thing that's both challenging and exciting is kind of how will our roles as conversation designers shift, and where do we fit in that landscape? It kind of makes me think back to like when there was the whole design thinking boom, and suddenly like everyone's a designer, and then it's like, well, if everyone's a designer, what are the designers doing? And I'm wondering if there'll be sort of a similar moment there for conversation design, where is it everyone just becomes a general designer, everyone becomes a conversation designer, and how do we kind of maintain that influence and make sure kind of conversational principles and maxims are kind of integrated into those experiences, even if they, no matter what kind of modality they take.
Joseph, Daniel?
Yeah, I feel like I've loosened up what my sense of my role is, which hopefully doesn't mean I don't have a clue, but has given me a flexibility to adapt and update. I think probably working more closely with engineering will be a goal of mine, because I think getting into the prompt deeper and system guidance, response module guidance, examples, also just testing that it does what the designs that I make say. But I think that's where the heart of the stuff is happening. So I hope to do more of that, and probably some more evaluation stuff as well.
Daniel, anything?
I think there's also, there's a lot of optimistic things we can think about in terms of the new things we now get to explore in terms of experience and conversation. Of course, it sounds like, I believe that perhaps the biggest challenge or a nice thing to have would be the ability to connect the new proposals, and I sense that there will be a lot of new proposals in every domain, in every vertical, in every industry that we will have to do as conversation designers. But tying that somehow to value cases and being able to argue for those in new use cases, I find that to be something that excites me about the future. I know that currently in Danske Bank we have a lot of freedom to investigate and explore and create those things. And truly, if we're able to discover them and put a value case next to them, then why not? And hopefully that's an arena, and I know that's an arena where conversation design has a lot to add and a lot to say, because experience and good experience is valuable. So it's just a challenge of being able to articulate that, to test that, to validate that, and yeah, to say that there's a bottom line that it influences in the end, of course.
Of course. Well, thank you so much, everyone, for being here. This was so insightful, and yeah, definitely have a lot of takeaways. I'm going to watch this again to make sure I catch everything. And thank you to Marlinda also for co-hosting this. And yeah, stay tuned. We have another panel. We have a couple more panels coming up. So yeah, we'll announce those soon. And yeah, have a great day, evening. Thank you for tuning in. Bye.
Awesome. Thank you all.
Bye. Thank
Thank
you.
you.